All right, so let's pick things up where we left off. Next slide, please. Thank you. First, for those who perhaps are a little bit less familiar with Power for All, we're an international organization that's focused simply on the good of energy access. We emerged from the sector itself in around 2015 and really started to focus on getting the ecosystem to work together. So our real mission is to mobilize a network of this energy access ecosystem that will help transform the way energy is used, generated, and paid for. Next slide, please. We came to this study on powering jobs for one very clear reason, is that we found that the diversity of jobs was really going not quite as understood as we needed it to be by government and development partners. Plus, there was no data to be had in the early days of Power for All. And so we decided to investigate ourselves with a ground up, statistically relevant approach. What kind of jobs are actually being created alongside the achievement of energy access for all? Next slide, please. To that end, what we're going to talk about today is the Powering Jobs goals, the actual context of the census, the research scope, and some of the estimates, as well as the trends and key insights. We'll have a section for Q&A towards the end of the discussion. And if you do have questions, please use the Q&A and not the chat. Next slide, please. First, before we go much farther, let me introduce briefly our esteemed panelists, and then you'll have a chance to meet them again during the interactive panel section. First, of course, is Carolina Pan, the Director of Research for Power for All. Followed by that is Suman Subarusho. Sorry, Suman, I've butchered your name. Forgive me, I'm sick. She is with the Global Alliance for People and Planet. Radhika Thakar, who is the Vice President of Corporate Affairs for Sun King, and Sylvia Satori, the Senior Project Manager for Energia. In addition is Deborah Rowe, who joins us from UNEP and the U.S. Partnership for Education and Sustainable Development. Divyam Nagpal, who is the Program Officer for Energy Access at IRENA, Joshua Wycliffe, who works with the International Solar Alliance, and of course, Isaac Kaima, the National Program Coordinator for the International Labor Organization. Next slide, please. Without any further ado, I just want to thank everyone who has helped make this possible. So in addition to our very generous funders, including the Rockefeller Foundation, Good Energies, and Get Invest, we also want to thank our global partners who've helped with survey outreach. So that includes AMDA, CLAF's shortlist, and the other partners that you see listed here. We couldn't have done this without, again, that sort of networked approach to getting information from over 300 companies throughout 5 countries to really understand what the scope of energy access jobs looks like. Next slide, please. So a bit about the context, and then we'll get on to the results. So we know that we need more companies to end energy poverty. I think most of us are fairly well aligned that this is no longer a technology problem. It's a distribution, access, and implementation issue. Altogether, and our numbers back this up, that this sector could be creating 4.5 million jobs by 2030. And in addition to that, they're great jobs that transform people's lives. So the goal is to have jobs and energy access pace each other, so we have that talent pipeline in place we need to end energy poverty. Next slide, please. So big high-level findings, which of course Carolina will get into in detail, is that the sector itself has proven to be incredibly resilient throughout the pandemic and created stable jobs. There is a gap in training programs, which is part of what we'll talk about today. And important, it's really critical to note that women tend to represent more of this workforce and renewables in general than other workforces, especially traditional fossil fuel industries. But we have a lot better we can do. And it's just really critical that we take on board all of these discussions today and figure out a path forward to have that training and development in place so we do have that workforce of the future. Next slide, please. So the great news is that this sector helps drive job creation. It is a resilient sector, and we are seeing that both PICO and SHS, or solar home systems, for those who are a little bit more new to the terminology, are indeed the engine driving employment in Africa. And we do want to see some more increasing of women's engagement in this sector, but there are some great lessons and learnings about what works to get women involved that we'll be sharing later. Next slide, please. And with that, let me turn things over to my dear friend and colleague, Carolina Pan, to take you through the actual findings. Carolina, over to you.
Thank you, Christina, and hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining our global launch of the Powering Jobs Census 2022. My name is Carolina Pan. I'm the Research Director at Power for All, and I'm going to walk you through our main findings of this 2022 report. But before that, I just want to acknowledge the broader research team at Power for All, particularly our research managers, Agustin Carbo and Hannibal Tesfagunen, for their hard work over these past many months. And next slide, please. And so regarding the scope of our census, this is actually our second census. The first census we did in 2019, and we covered 3 countries, India, Kenya, and Nigeria. For this second edition, we decided to add 2 more countries, Uganda and Ethiopia. For those 5 countries, we covered direct employment. So these are people directly employed by companies in the DRE sector. And this could be part-time employment, full-time employment, formal, informal, contractors, any type of employment. And this is for the period 2019 to 2023. So the survey was actually done at the end of 2021. So everything up until 2021 are actual numbers, and then 2022 and 2023 are projections. We cover 4 technology categories. So we cover pico-solar appliances, solar home systems, commercial and industrial standalone systems, and mini-grids. And in terms of methods, what we're doing is a bottom-up count, essentially. So we did primary data collection. We did surveys in the 5 countries over a representative sample of firms, and we collected over 350 responses overall. But that information we complemented with focus groups discussions. We did 1 in each country, so 5 in total, and also expert interviews. Next slide, please. So let me start with the numbers. This is actually our main contribution and the entire reason why we're doing the survey. This is where we found the largest knowledge gap in the sector. We found this time around that direct employment in India is about 80,000 people. And in Nigeria and Kenya, in each country, it's about 50,000 people. Now, this is obviously not the entire employment contribution of DRE, because there's obviously a lot of job creation that is generated from people just getting access to energy, like productive use of energy jobs, or also jobs that are created upstream. But this is just direct employment. And for being direct employment, these numbers are quite large. Just so that you can have a reference for Kenya, for instance, KPLC, which is Kenya Power and Lighting Company, the largest utility in the country, that company directly employs less than 8,000 people. Now, for Uganda and Ethiopia, this was our first time doing the survey, so we don't have benchmarks, but we do find that there are about 30,000 direct jobs created in Uganda, which is quite large given the size of the Ugandan market. Now, obviously, Uganda doesn't have the sales volume that Kenya or obviously Nigeria have, but we believe it's a big number. And for Ethiopia, we find this is about 14,000 direct employees. And we took this number to the focus groups discussions and the expert interviews to make sense of the smaller number compared to the other countries. And one of the things that we think could be happening is that there's some underreporting, particularly of informal workers, but there's also something very particular about how the Ethiopian market works and operates, in that a lot of companies hire or actually outsource their sales to smaller companies. So when we ask the companies how many products they sold and how many people they have, they are not accounting for the other employees from these other smaller companies that are involved in the sales of their products. The other interesting finding is in regards to the level of formality, because we found, as you can see, there's a lot of green. That means that most of the DRE jobs are formal, actually in all countries, but Kenya, which is quite interesting given that all of these economies are largely informal economies. Now, there's obviously, as I said before, some underreporting of informal jobs, and that's to be expected. But these numbers are also much larger than the ones that we got in the first survey. We do think there's also a COVID effect, that it's more likely for formal jobs to have survived through COVID. But there could also be a hint that something is changing within the sector, and that would be great news. Next slide, please. So now in terms of trends, and the big question here is how fast did countries recover from COVID? What we see is that obviously all of our 5 focus countries took ahead in 2020. Some of them also took ahead in 2021 in terms of DRE employment. Now we say that the sector has been super resilient because if you compare job loss in the DRE sector to job loss in the entire economy of each of these countries, the DRE sector did much, much better. In addition, we do see that for the 3 largest economies that we've identified in terms of employment within our group, obviously, which are India, Kenya, and Nigeria, they are either fully recovered or about to be fully recovered. So that's why we say that the sector has been very resilient. What we did is we fit our 5 focus countries into 3 different archetypes. The first one is the strong and immediate rebound from COVID-19, and that's the case of Nigeria. So if you look at Nigeria, obviously there was some very mild job loss in 2020 as compared to 2019, but then when you look at the performance in 2021, the growth in employment was massive. So not only they got back to pre-pandemic levels, but they really surpassed those. We do expect this growth to continue, and we believe that part of the reason why the country recovered so quickly was that the DRE sector had experienced a massive growth right before the pandemic, between 2017 and 2019. So that the pandemic just slowed down a process that was already occurring. Now, the second archetype is the slow but steady rebound. And there we have Kenya and India. So these are countries that had some job loss in 2020, but are recovering from that. And while they're not back yet at their pre-pandemic employment levels of 2019, we expect them to be at those levels, if not higher, by the end of 2022. And then finally, we have the no recovery yet. These are Ethiopia and Uganda. These are countries in which we haven't yet seen any employment growth since 2019. That doesn't mean that things cannot change. Obviously, everything that's a dashed line means projection. So that's not factual, but we expect that there won't be growth in the very short run, but things could obviously change. The other thing, as I said before, is that even though there haven't been any growth or any employment creation in the DRE sector in Ethiopia and Uganda since 2019, again, the sector did much better than the overall economy in terms of how it responded to COVID. Next slide, please. So now let me briefly go over the workforce and particularly the skills. So we classified the workers into 3 categories: unskilled, semi-skilled, and skilled. And this is based on the ILO definition of skill. And what we see is that except in Ethiopia, the unskilled labor force is quite smaller. It accounts for less than 25% of the workforce in the rest of the countries. And if you look at the skilled workforce in countries like India, this is about 70%. We did notice that the skill share correlates with the sector maturity. So India has a much more mature sector, in the sense that it has larger presence of mini grids and commercial and industrial systems. And those obviously require more advanced technical skills. So it's not surprising that the workforce is more skilled than in, let's say, Ethiopia, which is at the other end of the spectrum, where it's mostly the sales of pico solar appliances and doesn't require such advanced technical skills. We do expect that as the sector matures in each of those countries, so will the skill level will rise. Next slide, please. So obviously that a skilled workforce needs appropriate training. And when we look at training, we focus on two things. First is the hours of training, and then is the share of companies that actually provide some training. So you can see the bars here in the graph are hours. Blue bars are internal training hours. Green bars are external training hours. And the bubbles are the share of companies that provide any training. So we, from the survey responses, we got that over 50% of the companies actually provide some training, internal, external, or a combination of both. Now, the hours vary significantly by country. So in countries like Kenya, if you sum up internal training hours and external training hours, you get that the average worker gets about 120 hours a year in total training, whereas in Ethiopia, this is 50 hours per year. When we ask the companies to identify why they're not providing any training or what are the main barriers to providing more training, they talked about the lack of financial resources to provide training, the shortage of quality training programs, and this is obviously for external training programs, and the low tenure. And this is quite interesting because it speaks about their willingness to invest in their workers. So if they believe that the employees are going to leave, they don't want to invest in them and train them. Next slide, please. And to finalize, I want to talk a little bit about the female participation in the sector. So this is obviously very heterogeneous too across countries. It goes from 21% in India, which is pretty low, 28% in Uganda, 35% in Nigeria, 37% in Ethiopia, and 41% in Kenya. In Kenya and Nigeria, this is much higher than what we saw in the past survey, so that's good news. However, we're still far from gender parity. One thing that was interesting is that these shares actually mirror the overall female participation shares in each of these countries. Across all countries, we do see that there is an overrepresentation of females in very particular functions like administrative functions, like assistants or office management. And there is an underrepresentation in other type of functions like top management positions, leadership positions, or very technical positions. One thing that was quite interesting is when you look at the gender wage gap, it is smaller for every country except for Ethiopia. That's smaller than the national wage gap. However, it inversely correlates with the participation of women. So in those positions in which women are overrepresented, the wage gap is smaller than in those positions in which women are underrepresented, like the leadership and top management positions. In those positions, the wage gap is actually larger. So let me stop here because I know we have a very busy agenda and I'm happy to take questions at the very end. So Sue, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Carolina. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody who've joined us today. I'm Suranjana, and I'm the Director for Partnerships and Campaigns at Power for All. So thank you so much, Carolina, for taking us through the findings of the Powering Jobs Census. I think it's been a long ride for us, and it's been interesting to see how each country within the survey scope have actually fared post-pandemic. And given that we've got a stellar panel of DRE sector experts as well as practitioners today with us, I'd like to throw the floor open and hear what everybody has to say about the report, and how do you think a report like this is actually impacting the work that you're doing in your part of the sector. So if I could begin with Suman Suresh Babu, who's the MD of the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, GAP, and ask you, Suman, on how you feel a report like this is important for the work that GAP is doing in terms of catalyzing collaborative action.
Thanks so much, Suranjana, and thanks to the Power for All team and everyone for joining this webinar. This is an amazing report that really shines a light on the potential of the DRE sector to drive inclusive economic development and job growth in countries. And I think, as Carolina and others pointed out, that if you don't have any data, you don't really have a starting point. And so being able to start with data as a starting point for advocacy is so critical for the work we do at GAP and with partners such as yourselves. I'll speak a little bit more about GAP and what we're doing in the sector in the next session, but just to respond to the report directly, I wanted to just highlight a little bit on that last piece on gender, because I think that's the piece that, aside from the fact that there's so much job potential and job growth, which is such a positive finding of the report, I think there's a lot of potential for all of us who work in this sector to be more intentional and direct in our support of women in an emerging sector, because if we don't do anything, the trends are pretty clear of what's going to happen. Women will continue to stay in administrative jobs or lower paying jobs. We have a partnership with Shortlist that's just trying to start out by supporting women to enter into DRE companies and in more senior levels and non-traditional roles. And we are hoping to grow on that, build on that as we continue to grow and become more, do more work in this area. So I think that was just like one takeaway of the need for such intentionality that I wanted to highlight. But other than that, I think the report is extremely helpful. And that kind of data on gender is what we need to make investment decisions around where we place our capital. So that's how we would use it in our work. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Suman. And I think that just validates the need for a report like this. I'd like to move on to Radhika. Radhika is the VP at Sun King for Corporate Affairs. And Radhika, I know you're working at the heart and center of all the things that we've spoken about in the report. So if we can have your opinion on the report and how this impacts your work.
Sure. I think we're really excited about the launch of this report. For those that are not familiar with Sun King, we design, distribute, install, and finance solar home energy products for the 1.8 billion people that are living without reliable access to energy. Currently, we're the largest off-grid solar provider, and we've enabled access to 90 million people worldwide, including 1 in 5 Kenyans, and we have direct operations in a number of countries across Africa and South Asia. And one of the things that we're really excited about here is it highlights the vast impact our sector has already had when it comes to employment. And when we look at where we are as a sector, we're not even close to reaching SDG 7, right? We're picking up pace, of course, but when we look ahead, it's clear how much more of an impact we're going to have on livelihoods as we reach SDG 7, right? And this is something that I think has been left out of a lot of conversations related to energy access. Often it's about the connections, particularly in conversations with policymakers or in the crafting of energy access programs. And this needs to be part of those conversations because it's an important part of the calculation and decisions that policymakers, funders make when it comes to what kinds of programs are we funding, how are we looking at energy access. So we think that this data, we haven't had this kind of data quantified for the sector before. We think it's going to be tremendously valuable in these sorts of conversations, particularly as we look at how do we accelerate our pace to closing the energy access gap? So thanks to the team.
Thank you, Radhika. And that's fantastic because, I mean, we see the importance of putting together data like this that actually helps us meet the energy access gap, because if you don't have the humans who can actually help you do it, that's always going to be a big gap. I'd like to move on to Divyam, who works with IRENA, and IRENA also happens to have a jobs review. And I'm sure, Divyam, you would be seeing some parallels in the work that IRENA is also doing and from this report that we just launched. So over to you.
So thanks, Suranjana, and congratulations to the Power for All team and its partners on the launch of this excellent report. As you mentioned, at IRENA, since our very inception, in fact, since 2011, the first work stream, one of the first work streams that we started was on renewable energy jobs, is to better understand this link between what the energy transition and renewables means for jobs. And I think that really goes back to the point that was mentioned before, is that we really have to strengthen the sort of socioeconomic case for the energy transition. If you look at governments around the world, especially in developing countries, job creation is a key priority for them. And we cannot disconnect the energy transition, whether it's for DRE or large-scale renewables. We cannot disconnect it from the traditional national discourse. So having data around job, what investing in DRE means for jobs, definitely strengthens the case for investing in these solutions, in addition to all the other benefits that come with it. The report is extremely timely because in just a few days, we'll also be launching our Renewable Energy and Jobs Annual Review, which of course looks at the overall renewable energy sector more broadly. But I think it really complements the overall message that we're trying to put out, is that investing in renewables, whether it's DRE or whether it's utility scale renewables, stimulates economic activity, creates jobs, alongside a number of other benefits that come in terms of energy security and climate. How we can maximize those and what needs to be done from a policy perspective, we can touch on that in the next round of discussions. But thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Divyam. And since you spoke of energizing the economy, I think I'd like to move on to Isaac Kiema from the ILO. And I'm very sure, Isaac, ILO is doing a lot of work in terms of being able to provide jobs as well as energizing economies in the countries that you're present. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suranjan. And I want to join my colleagues in congratulating the team that did this great job. Following that particular report, let me say that my role is to coordinate public-private development partnerships in Kenya on behalf of the ILO. And this is in a place where we basically have the geothermal investors. And the report that has been presented to us actually resonates well with the dialogue that has been happening on platforms, matters to do with the creation of jobs. I totally agree with you, Suranjana, in terms of you saying that the ILO is doing quite a lot of work in terms of creating jobs. We are very keen on skills development, and this is why recently we were actively involved in the development of prior recognition policy in Kenya. We have other initiatives that are targeting the small micro enterprises, but specifically talking about the geothermal, where we are. I want to mention that recently, around 2 months ago, the Geothermal Association of Kenya invited me for their annual conference, and the discussions which were in that particular conference are actually what we are talking about in this particular report. So I would say very timely. The International Labour Organization will also be very keen in terms of looking at how then these decent jobs are. One of our key social partner in Kenya, that is the Federation of Kenya Employers, they have continuously talked about how much investors or employers are spending in terms of reskilling workers. And so details in terms of where are the gaps and that kind of discussion is what we should focus on. So then we strengthen the sector. And the report is clearly articulating that is one area that which will create a lot of jobs, and we need to give a lot of focus on that. As I conclude, I'm happy that Kenya has been highlighted with the leading in terms of women participation, being a very vocal country on matters to do with gender. And I must say yes, because we've seen that trends whereby women are taking over male so-called dominated jobs, and we can see that kind of dynamic shifts. But then how do we encourage them so that they can motivate the entire population? And so these jobs are not only looked at as though they belong to men, but the entire community. But I look forward to a very fruitful discussion. And once again, congratulations to the team. This is very, very, very resourceful. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Isaac. And since I know you spoke about skills and training, I think the natural segue would be to Deborah, who's the president of the US Partnership for Higher Education and Sustainable Energy. And Deborah, I know we've been working closely with you over the last few months since you were part of our steering committee as well. So please let us know what you feel about the report and how this impacts the work that you do.
Well, of course, I'm excited about the report. And I want to say congratulations to two groups. Congratulations to Power for All for getting this report done and sharing knowledge with the wider community. But the other group I want to congratulate is everybody in the audience in anticipation of how you're going to use this report. That's where we're really going to make progress, right? And the report shows a lot of progress going on, but also gaps that are creating divides. We need more recruitment, more availability of education and training for youth and underrepresented groups, as well as the general population. We need better connections between educators and local companies' needs. I really think DRE companies should be treated special, and that we should streamline all the processes so it's easier for them to get the workers that they need. We need to make sure that the curricula is inclusive of the applications being used in DRE, such as solar water pumps, cold storage for health, such as vaccines, and a variety of farm-based applications, including but not limited to solar food processing. You know, we have an international project for our U.S. Partnership for Education for Sustainable Development, where we have convened publishers in the U.S. to update textbooks and curricula materials, and DRE needs to be included more. It's not there as much as it needs to be so that the students aren't even aware of the career pathways. We need such a curricular updating project internationally, more comprehensively, to include DRE. And curricular boards that make those decisions need to approve the updates of the curricula. We also need to upgrade the development of our educators so that they can teach this. We need to work with career advisors and career advising associations too for recruitment. I'll speak about that more a bit later. This report is an excellent resource to understand the details for our steps forward together with all of you in the audience and your respective networks as you share this report with them. I look forward to seeing the positive outcomes after you use this report to inform your next steps, your decisions, and your actions. And thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Deborah. And I'd like to call on Joshua Wycliffe now from the International Solar Alliance, where he's the Chief Operating Officer. And Joshua, I know that the agenda of the ISA is to ensure the uptake of DRE, the uptake of solar energy across all the countries that you're collaborating with. So how does a report like this impact the work that you're doing, and how can this be used by policymakers and decision makers?
Thank you, Suranjana. First of all, let me congratulate Power for All for this great, excellent release and launch of this report. Yes, correctly as you identified, big role in ISA's work going forward. One of those things I would like to say is the reason why I feel this would play a great role is because of the most valuable synergies that I find in the work and in the studies that and the results and reports that have been launched, as against ISA's vision in achieving universal access to energy. And studies like this, to us, would support knowledge management and also knowledge development creation towards a wide range of governments, CSO groups, NGO groups, and partner with the broader groups within the sector. Three things come to mind straight away, listening into the presentation. One of them is, of course, the regulatory gaps and the training that would be required. As we expand into businesses, as the businesses expand into newer markets, especially rural communities, it's very important that the regulatory gaps are filled, that people are trained and upskilled as well. I can give an example. There are markets where we are looking at floating solar, then, of course, they're faced with regulatory issues in environment impact assessment modeling and things like that. So ISA has now established resources where they can work in through those markets, support through the EIA studies and EIA education to the businesses and businesses that with potential abilities to expand into newer geographies and geographies where there are concerns from the public sector in terms of environment impact assessment. Another area that, of course, straight away comes to mind is the financial risk management facility, which we are working on, a facility that would create and build on risk mitigation instruments, like, for example, payment guarantees and mechanisms, first loss guarantee and things like that for businesses who would like to get into markets and expand, especially within Africa. So these are three areas that readily come to mind looking at the report that has just been launched. It's an excellent report, an excellent resource, and I look forward to working with the wider group, me and our teams. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joshua. That's very heartening to hear. And I'd like to move on to Sylvia and round up this round of reactions from the panel. Sylvia is the senior manager at Energia, and I know that you work in the cross-section of gender as well as sustainable energy. So Sylvia, I know that part of the report over here definitely has some very direct meaning for the work that you do at Energia. So over to you.
Thank you, Suranjana. First of all, on behalf of Energia, I would like to join my colleagues here and congratulate you for pursuing dedicated research and data on the gender dimension of this topic. This is unfortunately not always a common practice, at least not yet. And we believe that this research contributes to highlight the importance of collecting gender disaggregated data and shedding more light on the role and the contributions of different genders and also how they're being impacted. The findings that are coming out of this research, and particularly those on gender, are very much well aligned with our own experience across Africa and Asia. For the past 26 years, Energia is an international network of organizations and professionals that, as you said, is working at the nexus of SDG 5 and SDG 7, has been working tirelessly to promote equal and equitable access to and control over sustainable energy for men and women, particularly for those living in remote areas without electrification. Despite being the main household managers and caregivers, being in charge of procuring resources, women continue to have less access to and less control over energy and energy services compared to men. In line with the findings of the census, women are still significantly underrepresented in the clean energy supply chain, as well as in clean energy policymaking dialogues. So we trust that these events and this publication play a very important role and are a very important opportunity to raise awareness and to take measures on this critical question. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. And of course, we'll unpack a little bit more around the gender conversation as we go on with the panel. Thank you very much, everybody, for giving us your first reactions on the report. And we will, of course, have questions from the audience. But prior to that, I think what I'd like to do is to just talk about three of the dominant themes that we've seen emerging from the report. And these are training and youth, creating a meaningful career path to attract talent and youth into the DRE sector. The second is favorable growth environment. How can the role of public and private enterprise actually foster both DRE adoption, jobs growth, and economic stimulus? And the third is bridging the gender gap, the opportunity the DRE actually creates to break traditional gender workplace roles. So we'll begin with the first theme, which is training and youth, and how can we create meaningful career paths? And I'll begin with a question for Radhika. Radhika, there are over 500,000 direct DRE jobs globally, with about 374,000 direct DRE jobs across the African continent and about 80,000 in India. So how do we find the people to fill these jobs, and how can we actually develop the human capacity pipeline to deliver SDG 7, which is the point that you made earlier on as well?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go back to a point that Carolina made, which is on on how many companies invest in, or how many hours companies invest in internal and external training today, right? Think about that range. On the low end, it's 50 hours. That's very much on the low end. And on the upper end, we're seeing on average 120 hours, even an hour a week, or, you know, splitting out 2 to 3 hours a week. That's a tremendous amount of time, but it also has a lot of direct impact, and it enables us to develop a workforce, particularly in areas where people have been underemployed. I think that focus on training really resonates with our experience. It's quite consistent with what we do at Sun King. We're a pretty large rural employer. We have about 15,000 field sales agents in mostly rural or up to semi-urban areas, or, you know, kind of, sort of peri-urban areas. And almost half of those agents are women. So, you know, what we're tapping into is a workforce or segments of our population that are underemployed, but really hungry to work and have a lot of time and energy here. So what we do is we seek people that are hungry to work, that are capable, and that have perspectives that are relevant for our work. A lot of our work is bringing energy solutions to rural communities. Who better to tap than the people from the communities there? And then we train them. And, you know, I think thinking about like 120 hours a year per person can feel really daunting, but it's not classroom training necessarily. Some of it might be. A lot of it in our case is we make tiny modules, you know, really short modules that are delivered through smartphones that people can watch while they're waiting for their bus, you know, or while they're commuting, as long as they're not driving. And a lot of it's coaching. It's how do you teach someone how to do something? It's how do you take them on the road and you know, help them grow in their careers. And you know, part of this was a bit of a necessity for us. I don't think we started this business thinking let's invest in training. It was a necessity because when we began, there wasn't a distributed renewable energy industry at the size that it is today. So we had to find people from relatable industries, telecom, people that were selling airtime, that were, you know, holding other positions within their communities, and teach them what a solar lamp is, what a solar home system is, how it provides value to people in their communities, how to provide financing and things like that. And so it's been a little bit core to certainly to our culture as a company. And maybe just a little bit to bookend, when I think back to like 13 years ago when we were beginning, we couldn't recruit anyone who had experience in this industry. That wasn't an option. Today, when we are, you know, when we're looking at talent for jobs, we do see people with experience from our industry. And we have seen people from Sun King go on to other companies or other, you know, aspects of our industry. It's still early. I think the majority of people that come into our company today are still new to distributed energy, and therefore we are, you know, providing them a lot of training. But I think that's really important for all of us in the sector. And over time, as this industry becomes more mature, we will have more people whose, you know, career paths are in distributed renewable energy. It's happening. It's happened already in a decade in some countries. So I think, you know, training is just so key.
Thank you, Radhika. And that's a fascinating point you make, that you actually had to not just upskill, but you had to cross-skill people, because you didn't get people who were actually native DRE sector workers or technicians. So that's a fantastic point. Thank you so much. Still staying on the theme of training, I'm going to move on to Deborah. And Deborah, what according to you are the skills gaps that aren't getting met with the current training programs? And I know that you work very closely with TVETs and other curriculum developers. So if you could shed some light on that, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Well, first I want to talk about some additional information. So in addition to this wonderful report, keep an eye out for an IRENA survey that's going on now that will have skills gaps as a focused result. Also, the recent LinkedIn report and the upcoming taxonomy is going to help. Also, in a couple of months, Solar Power Europe is doing a service for the world. They have created a platform that will be usable in all countries, that will match potential workers or interested people who want to work in the field with available jobs And they'll be able to identify what skills they have and compare it to the skills the companies want. This will help identify missing skills and provide access to educational opportunities internationally. So the same platform is going to say, okay, you need these skills, you don't have them, here's a place where you can go to get them. So we've found that skills gaps vary by region. You know, we've been running these international solution summits where we've had a lot of input from employers and educators and others. So please, please do not just train technicians and engineers. You know, DRE companies have told us over and over again, they also need managers, marketers, salespeople, financiers, and other job categories. Educational TVETs tend to think in terms of technicians, but they need to move beyond that. Educational institutions and training organizations need to connect with urgency to these clean energy companies. And as I say, treat them special because they're helping to keep the planet habitable and stabilize our climate. So really go out of your way with extra effort to help them find the workers they need. Educational institutions can also improve their internship and their job placement processes, making it easier for the companies as well to provide input into the curricula. The companies know what they need. When educational institutions host events for the public, and I hope they do often, with DRE businesses as presenters, and if they can't make it each time, they could do, you know, a video, or I love the cell phone approach. It improves student recruitment, but also helps the companies become better known. It's a win-win. I agree with Radhika that we need to bring the curricula in bite-sized modules on cell phones where they can fit it into their daily schedules and provide the coaching for success. So I would like to see more alumni groups and mentoring and coaching even after they've taken the courses in order to help people stay in the field. I would also suggest that the companies, and some have done a very good job of this, they really need to be welcoming to the underrepresented groups. Sometimes that culture has to change. So please search on the internet for the phrase UNEP and green jobs. Saranjana, I'm going to give you the link because I can't post in the chat to everybody. You'll then see the global guidance document that I co-authored. It's got 81 educational resources and a framework. Join the virtual community to be invited to our Solution Summit series and to become part of the Green Learning Network, which is a multiple UN agency platform for ongoing networking and sharing of strategies by everyone involved in this area. As youth here today, as companies and as educators, as policymakers, you are all encouraged to join in. I'll put the link in the chat. One last thing for recruitment, start young. Instead of climate doom and gloom, let's get young people excited about DRE early in their learning, get it into curricula, show the roles they can play as clean energy heroes for their communities. Do not forget the unemployed youth and women in the informal economy. Reach out to where they are, once again, via their cell phones and other non-traditional communication pathways, and share with them the excitement of being part of this DRE clean energy transition. Also, companies need to promote women more. You heard it earlier. I'm going to emphasize it again. We need to see women in higher level positions so entrants can see a career pathway. Later this week, we are at the Clean Energy Ministerial Conference discussing a more comprehensive policy approach, which is very much needed. We need, last thought, we need a coordinated whole of society approach where ministers of education, employment, clean energy, economic development, and social well-being collaborate across their ministries for coordinated policies and programs that will produce not just the workers we need, but the consumer education, the financing, and the other components needed for a robust and just clean energy transition.
Thank you, Deborah. And Power for All will also be at the Clean Energy Ministerial on the 22nd, where Carolina will also be talking about the findings from this report. So do look out for that, and we can share the link to that event as well in the chat box. Still staying on the theme of training, my next question is for Isaac from ILO. And since Deborah spoke about training the youth, here's a question that's very youth focused for you, Isaac. And have you seen trends on growing youth interest in the sector? as well as a balance in terms of, interest from the hiring activities of training institutes and organizations where they'd really like to be able to hire young people and sort of train them through a career graph with them. So both ends of the spectrum. Are the youth interested, and are companies and educational institutions?
You can hear me? Great. I think we lost Suranjana. Suranjana, are you okay?
Yes,
Great.
I think I lost my network for a second. Sorry about that. Were you able to hear all of my question, Isaac?
Yeah, apart from the final, yeah. Let me give it a try. Yes, there's a trend that resonates with the question that Suranjana, you're asking, in terms of we are seeing an increased interest by the young people. And one of the things that we'd be probably looking at in terms of the gaps, you asked a very nice question, and Deborah, I think she did justice to answer that question. We're looking at, in terms of creating awareness among the youth or among the young people on the changing dynamics in terms of technology in this particular sector, and the future of work, the entire globalization and how it's changing the dynamics at the workplace. And so this is where we are seeing a shift in terms of change dynamics, and seeing young people creating a lot of interest in this. I mentioned probably some of this part of the report that has highlighted women, high number of women participation in Kenya in some of these jobs is simply because we have some young people who are coming from either the vocational training centers or the technical training institutions, and now they want to explore this kind of jobs. Talk about, like, for example, the mechanical, talk about the plumbing and those machine operator skills. So yes, we've seen that. And let me mention that the International Labour Organization is the only United Nations agency, a tripartite organization in nature, whereby it's a formation of employers, workers, and government. And that kind of dialogue, we normally have it on table. And the current Decent Work Country program of the year 2021 to 2024 gives high prominence in terms of skills, because skills development and exploring how the dynamics and the future of work is moderating and giving opportunity for these young people to access skills, and more so employability. What we've been able to do is to bring the private sector, the employers, and the training institutions, for example, the TVETs, and also the community at large, and also the governments, both the national government and the county governments, to have a dialogue in terms of the demand-driven skills by the investors. So then we don't have a trend whereby students or graduates are exiting from the institutions, and then they proceed to a level whereby the employers or the private sector companies or investors have to invest another resource kind of investment to reskill this kind of young people. So then there's that need of collaboration. And what I want to say in totality is that the public-private development partnerships is a direction to go. In any way to achieve the kind of trends and to address the issues that have been raised by this particular report, we need to work in partnership. We need to listen to what the private sector, who are the employers, are saying, be it formal, be it informal sector. And we also need to have an engagement and dialogue with the institutions in terms of the curricula which they are offering. So then it brings the skills that are required, because the employers talk about multinationals or the locals, they're coming up with sophisticated machines, and all they want to do is to make profit. So they'll bring any machine or technology that will give them the fast-making process, profit-making process. And so we need also to introduce the institutions in that kind of system whereby they can address that kind of mismatch. And this is where now we'll bring the appetite of young people looking forward to access these jobs. There are quite a lot of stories which can be, or examples which can be cited, but in terms of ensuring that we have champions, we have models, we have mentors who can infuse the young people into this sector, then yes, I say there is that kind of energy, there's that kind of willingness, but we need to ensure that the ecosystem and the entire conveyor belt then addresses that kind of appetite, and also interesting the young people into these employment opportunities.
Thank you so much, Isaac. And I like that analogy of the conveyor belt and also the point that you made on public and private partnerships being extremely important. And staying on that theme of public and private partnerships, I'm going to move on to our next track, which is in terms of how can we actually build a favorable growth environment for the DRE sector, and what is the role that both public and private enterprise can play in fostering DRE adoption, jobs growth, as well as economic stimulus. And so my next question is for Suman. Suman, how do you think public and private partnerships can actually help create more demand for DREs to be able to not only expand the sector, but also bridge existing policy gaps? And also if after Suman, Joshua could also answer the same question, but first Suman.
Sure, thanks so much. And, you know, I think the last speaker was just talking about this and how critical it is to the growth of the sector. You know, we have a long way to go. I think only 1% of global new renewable power capacity was added in sub-Saharan Africa in 2020. And the IEA estimates that, and this won't be news to anybody, that 70% of clean energy investments, which is about $700 billion a year, need to be privately financed. And so really bringing in the private sector and supporting the growth of the private sector is key for a just and equitable transition. And that's really one of the founding principles behind the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. And this is a new institution that was launched last year, and it's an alliance of entrepreneurs, governments, technology companies, policy, financiers, really to use grant financing to unlock the private sector around three major goals: reducing carbon emissions, improving access, and driving jobs. And I think those three going together is what really gets us to this equitable and inclusive transition. We focus on three areas: enabling environment, innovation and entrepreneurship, risk capital, which might seem similar to what a lot of others focus on. I think we try to support new and innovative approaches in the sector. And I think I'd like to just give an example of this public-private partnership in action to really put some detail behind what we do. So in Ethiopia currently, in a few weeks, we're going to be launching the DREAM initiative, which is a partnership between private DRE companies, the government of Ethiopia, around piloting the sort of largest mini grid driven irrigation project on the continent. So this will be irrigating 26,000 hectares with 50 megawatts of solar and supporting farmer incomes to grow by 80% or above, which is really exciting. And I think that part of what I was saying, trying to support the private sector to come in, is really creating the connections with the Ministry of Agriculture, with the Agriculture Transformation Institute, and with partners on the ground to make it create a sort of demand, really support demand in terms of building that economic engine which can drive energy access. So innovating and trying out these new kinds of models is what we're about. And I think that's what sort of allows the private sector to come in with more confidence. And I think part of that is really focusing on jobs as part of the supply side, but also jobs on the demand side, which I know that this report didn't cover, but I'm hoping that in the future we can dive more into that, because one of the big massive drivers of why governments should invest in private sector DRE companies is because of the huge economic opportunity that comes from the jobs that are created by people using the energy, right? So, and that requires a pathway to show how that's possible. And investing in demand and supply, as we're doing in Ethiopia, is like one such way that we're going about that. Yeah, so maybe I'll leave it at that to just talk a little bit about what we've done and pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Suman, and especially for illustrating the model of work that GIAP is doing in Ethiopia. I think that really brings to life how can a public and private partnership actually work in terms of creating the pathway both for demand and supply. And I'll ask the same question now of Joshua. Joshua, given the work that you do with different governments and policymakers at ISA, what has your experience been in terms of, what can be done in terms of policy change to create this favorable sort of conducive enabling environment for the sector itself to grow and for jobs as well to be created?
Thank you. a key area that, like I said earlier, briefly, was creating a facility that would build on the mitigation instruments. Like if you took Africa, for instance, the African continent would need to double its capacity to about 497 gigawatts between now and 2030 to meet its rising electricity demand. And if this has to be achieved, it is imperative that both the government and the private sector work together closely. If you look at it currently, the continent accounts for a meager 1% of the 6.6 gigawatts of global solar energy production. As of 2018, solar and wind jointly account for only 3% of the electricity generated in Africa. So this presents a tremendous opportunity, and the bridge between this, the opportunity that's presented and what needs to be done, would be working with the private sector, and the governments would work towards the regulatory openness, being open to regulatory adjustments, filling in the gaps. And ISA plays an important role, like I said earlier, in being able to bridge these gaps in providing the training, providing capacity development within the public sector. And also the private sector, and bringing them together and facilitating further growth and expansion. I also spoke earlier about a risk mitigation instrument or instruments that we look at, including payment guarantee mechanisms, first loss guarantee, etc. This facility has and will continue to help ISA in advocating for solar as a preferred choice across the globe, bringing in a strong pipeline of bankable PPA, private-public sector partnership, bankable projects on the ground in Africa, and of course, expanding to other geographies as well, and help mobilize investments, getting a good range of potential funders. That would help build a well-rounded approach, a risk that's mitigated, a sector that is prepared to work together, and a sector that's prepared to invest and receive investments. This facility that the International Solar Alliance is building is on readiness, investment, and risk mitigation pillars. And the readiness money that we would raise would be used, apart from project preparation, would also support, introduce policies, support policymakers to enable a regulatory structure and create private sector demand and payment, of course, to private sector developers so they can pay back investors. And also parallelly, in close association with the facility, ISA will continue to work with members and create interventions in areas that would help attract investments, particularly in those countries where projects under the facility are being considered strongly. So these are some of the areas that ISA would continue to work. Our key markets recently have been working within the South Asian countries and also Africa. Bangladesh is a country we're working closely. Ethiopia. As an organization, we also focus on SIDS and least development countries as well. So we believe we are and we will continue to make a difference using some of these facilities and deploying some of these facilities in these markets. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joshua. That was really, really encouraging to hear. And again, staying on the theme of building conducive environments, my next question is for Divyam from IRENA. Divyam, we've seen that this sector, and again, this is something that the report also highlights, that the sector is actually more resilient than several others post-pandemic. So how can we actually go about building a stronger workforce, and what role, again, do policymakers have in promoting the sector?
Thanks, Rajna. And I think a lot of the points have been mentioned, but just to say that I think if the sector is not healthy and if the sector is not growing sustainably, then the jobs that it creates also tend to suffer. So I think that's where policymaking and governments have an important role to play. So just a few points. Well, number one, we have the evidence now, so there really is no excuse to not recognize DRE solutions as part of national energy access strategies. So let's give the standalone systems, the mini grids, the interconnected mini grids, its right space within the national energy access strategies. Then governments, of course, need to come in, and Joshua pointed that out, is to have a stable policy and regulatory environment which helps the sector grow sustainably over a period of time and thus create the kind of jobs that we require. And this does require public financing to be committed, as Suman highlighted, for viability gaps to be covered for end users, enterprises. And unless we don't have that foundation, then whatever we build on it eventually collapses over a period of time. Third point that I'd like to highlight is that we also have to look at the broader policy tools, as Deborah mentioned. How can we use industrial policy tools to look beyond just the deployment or the installation phase? Can we localize certain parts of the value chain? Can we create jobs in those parts, in assembly, maybe some manufacturing for the systems, but also for productive end-use appliances? On the skills and capacity building side, of course, we need to invest in strengthening local academic institutions, training centers. We need to do skills mapping, but also incubators. So we need to, of course, create the supply chain for the skills and the jobs that will be created, but we also need job creators. So how do we also strengthen the local incubation centers to support the local enterprises that want to sort of be active in this space? As Suman mentioned again, that induced PUE jobs is really where the meat of the matter is, and your report recognizes that almost 2 to 4 times direct jobs can be created there, and that requires cross-sector collaboration and linking DRE with livelihoods. And a final point really on investing in more data and initiatives like this. Can we cover more countries, and specifically countries that are not the usual ones? Even when we talk about investments, we have a magnitude problem, but we also have a concentration problem. So the Africa Market Analysis report that we launched earlier this year found that cumulatively investments in the off-grid sector in Africa, less than about 6-7% went to Central African countries. And even within West Africa, there are certain countries in East Africa which don't get to see the kind of investments that they do need to. So how do we invest in more data to guide decision-making from the private sector, but also funders into those countries, but also more tech? How do we look at micro-hydro, looking at biomass, and go beyond the sort of solar emphasis? And finally, on the skills gap, IRENA has this leveraging local capacity series, which kind of looks deeper into at each stage of the value chain, what kind of skills are required, what kind of training needs exist, and that can help policymakers in sort of investing and planning for those skill requirements. I think governments and policymakers overall have a big role to play, most importantly, to create sustainable foundations for the sector to grow, and then building on top of that to maximize the job creation potential.
Thank you so much, Divyam. And that's a great point you make in terms of the localization of skills across the value chain. And of course, we also recognize the importance of both induced as well as productive use of energy jobs. That's something that needs far more in-depth study and analysis. And there's a lot of intersectionality between all the answers that all of you have given us, and we see that your work obviously clearly overlaps. Everybody understands what the needs are in terms of building that conducive policy and financial landscape as well for the sector to grow and for jobs to not just be created but also to be absorbed by the sector. I'm going to move on to our third and final track, which is in terms of gender. And this is bridging the gender gap. And I know that we've got a lot of people who have, who are working in this space to be able to mainstream gender in the DRE sector. So the question is around what is the opportunity that DRE actually has to break traditional gender workplace roles? And my first question is for Sylvia from Energia. So from the research, Sylvia, we've seen that there is progress in hiring more women in the sector, and that women's participation has increased in the informal sector and also on the administrative side. But how can we actually empower more women to pursue technical jobs and increase their participation in the sector overall?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for asking this question, which is indeed very critical. About years ago, with our coalition of other international donors, we have launched in 3 countries in Africa and in Asia a program called Gender and Energy Innovation Facility, whose purpose was precisely to address some of the persisting barriers that prevent women from fully participating to and benefiting of the clean energy sector. A number of the projects that we have been supporting under this umbrella have been testing innovative solutions to expand the employment of women and young girls in technical positions within the clean energy sector. The very first interesting finding was that there's a big appetite locally from young girls, but also from women, to enroll in such careers. We have identified two main sets of challenges that undermine the ability to then pursue these careers in practices. In turn, these challenges are where we can look at and act upon to further empower women. One first set of challenges is about societal and cultural norms that have already been mentioned earlier, about the nexus between genders and jobs, meaning cultural stereotypes, beliefs, and practices about which gender can perform which jobs, with women being usually not associated with technical roles. So first, there's a need for new social narratives and new role models about women in STEM. From our experience on the ground, we saw that the most effective interventions to this effect were those that did not target exclusively girls and women. Rather, they used a community-oriented approach where men, village leaders, and the elderly were also engaged. Such a transformational shift of societal values, practices, and habits can only be successful if it is fully understood and backed up by families and communities. Secondly, the challenge of girls' access to technical education and training is in turn correlated to other challenges, including restrained mobility for girls and women who are not able or do not feel safe to travel to school. A limited availability of female trainers for female trainees was also reported in a number of instances. And so was the lack of suitable working equipment, facilities, recruitment and employment practices for women in technical roles. Third, from our experience supporting over 8,000 women entrepreneurs in remote areas, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, we believe it is important also to acknowledge, promote, and celebrate the unique potential and role that women have as ambassadors of DRE solutions, all the more in isolated off-grid communities. Especially in these locations, women are uniquely positioned to access households, to mobilize networks that are vital to promote a wider access to and uptake of DRE solutions. Enabling a wider participation of women in the sector in technical roles shall encompass also this segment. That is to say that beyond fostering employment of women in technical positions in DRE companies themselves, we shall also strive to enable a conducive environment where women can contribute to DRE in an entrepreneurial capacity. This requires a set of dedicated measures at the policy level, technical and agency trainings, but also changes to the financial sector, where women still face more barriers in accessing capital. As clean energy entrepreneurs, women then become empowered economically, but also socially and in the leadership that they play in their household and in their communities. And very importantly, they then generate new employment at the local level for both men and women. And we have seen that in many instances, these additional jobs have actually become also an alternative to migration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. And my last and final question before we open it up for a couple of audience questions is now addressed to Radhika and once again to Sylvia, but first Radhika. Radhika, in terms of, again, bridging the gender gap, we continue to see different salaries, of course, being offered to men and women. And that's not just true of this sector alone, of course, but more so in the top level management roles. So how can we reduce the gender pay gap? And is there something specific that Sun King is doing?
Sure. Yeah, I think an approach that we took was some number of years ago, we went through a pretty rigorous approach actually to look at what is the pay gap generally, look at a very specific position across different countries or even within one country and look at what is the range of compensation. And certainly we looked at that from a gender perspective as well. And we did a lot of cleaning up. So we came up with policies and structured approach to compensation internally. So we have bands for each grade level and for each type of role and parameters to indicate, how someone can move from one side of the band to the other. And that's based on experience and merit. So these sorts of policies and really kind of structured approaches, I think are required to eliminate bias as much as possible, and certainly when it comes to gender. But the other thing that we've realized is policies like this aren't enough, because if you don't have enough women moving up the ranks, it almost doesn't matter how perfect your policy is, right? If you're only 10% female at the top or 20%, women at the top, it's great that they have pay parity, but they're not present in an equal way. And so that's the other thing that we have been focused on as a company quite a bit in the last couple of years. And, one thing that stood out for me in the research and was, interesting, perhaps encouraging, is that the gender balance in our industry seems to reflect more or less the inclusion of women in the general workforce in each of these countries. So, one hand, maybe that's encouraging. We're at least doing as well as the norms in each country. But if we want to strive to equality or, parity, 50-50%, we've got to work so much against the grain, right? As Sylvia mentioned, there's a lot of cultural, norms that we have to be mindful of. And, if we want to move towards balance, we've got to work around it. And so that's a lot of what we've been doing at Sun King is around this. How do we actively work at, beyond the typical norms, let's say, to invite more inclusion. And that inclusion is important because 50% of the users of our technology are women. So it's, for us, it feels not appropriate to have an imbalanced workforce going out and speaking with and supporting and serving our customers. So a few examples of the active approaches that we've been taking. One is as simple as measuring gender disaggregated data and showing it, particularly to our business function leaders and our leadership team. Visibility creates awareness and, in really subtle but meaningful ways, makes people aware. And then there's much more active things. So we have rolled out a more inclusive recruiting process where we are training anyone that's involved in interviewing to take a less biased approach. And as much as we're even gender blinding some parts of our recruiting process. And a lot of this actually, some of those ideas were inspired by Shortlist, one of the partners on this work, who'd done a great piece on gender blinding in the recruiting process. We also have programs to support women that are in underrepresented roles within our company. So about 15% of our field sales managers are women. And that's just not a role that is very typical for women in a lot of the places that we operate to hold. So we want to make sure the 15% that are there feel supported, empowered, and have pathways to continue growing. We don't want to lose them there. And so we've created a vast program of mentorship and training to enable them to succeed and to ensure that we have policies and programs to make it conducive for them, particularly as they move on in their life and have families and partners and children and things like that. And finally, the other thing that we're doing is looking at how can we pull more women into these sorts of roles. So I think the report also shows that women tend to occupy more entry-level roles. So it's a great starting point. So we're taking an active approach to thinking about how can we expose women in entry-level roles to various opportunities to progress in their career within Sun King. A lot of what we found is that there isn't awareness on how to move up, or they lack, particularly in more rural areas, education or training or confidence to interview for those next levels. So we're developing programs that provide training. Again, bite-sized learning is really useful, but coaching, and a lot of that is working with internal mentors and people that have already moved up within their careers. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. We're doing a lot, but we really think that an active approach and visibility internally is really important to improving the gender gap.
Thank you, Radhika, and congratulations to Sun King for taking such an inclusive approach. I'm really hoping that soon becomes the norm rather than the exception in the sector. And similar question to you, Sylvia, which is in terms of what is Energia doing in terms of identifying this sort of gender pay gap, and what are the ways in which you're solving for it?
Yeah, well, I fully second everything that Radhika has just said. She's anticipated much of what I wanted to say from my side. Maybe I'll add another point, because about 1 year ago these days, together with UNIDO and GWNet, we launched what is being called the Gender and Energy Compact, which is a global multi-stakeholder coalition to catalyze action towards gender equality and women's empowerment to accelerate a just, inclusive, and sustainable energy transition. This coalition is bringing together governments, private sector, academia, civil society, youth, and international organizations. And they, either individually or collectively, as signatories of the compact, are voluntarily committing to specific actions that bring the compact to life and create impact on the ground. Supporting women's employment in the energy sector is one of the specific fields targeted by the Compact, with the vision that women enjoy decent and productive employment, workplace policies and practices support recruitment and retainment of women, and women are equally involved in policy and decision-making fora discussions. So taking actions to reduce the gender pay gap is one specific type of commitment that partners can undertake in this realm. So I would like to take this opportunity here today to call for more stakeholders from the international community, whether from the public or the private sector, to join the Compact and to work with us to enable women to have equal access and control over sustainable energy products and services, as well as to enjoy equal opportunities to lead, participate in, and benefit from a just, sustainable, and inclusive energy transition. More details on the applications can be found on the dedicated website, genderenergycompact.org, and I remain available for any further information that might be needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. And I'm really hoping that more people actually join in and collaborate with you on the Compact. It's much needed for the sector. So that's the end of the questions that we have for the panel, but we probably have time for a couple more really quick audience questions. And the first question that I have is for you, Carolina, and this is on the methodology of the survey itself. I'm just going to read these questions out for you, kind of combining them into one. So it is, can you provide a short overview of the methodology and how you formulated projections? What were the challenges you encountered with the survey and formulating these figures? This is from Francis and Joseph.
Okay, thank you for the question. So first, let me say that we have a full methodology appendix in the report with numbers, assumptions, and everything that's very complete, but I'm going to try to answer this quickly. So basically what we did is we asked the companies in the survey how about their sales numbers and their employment numbers. So we calculated for each country, let's say employment over like number of employees over total sales. This would be for Pico Solar and solar home systems, but then for commercial and industrial standalone systems and mini grids, we did it over installed capacity. But essentially, this is what we call the employment factor. And then we multiply this employment factor by the total size of the market. This is total sales in the market that come from different sources. As you can see in the report, it's mostly Bogla and Irina. But that's basically how we get the country aggregates. And in terms of difficulties, from the survey, I mean, logistically, there's obviously a lot of difficulties in running a survey. It's hard to reach to a lot of companies, especially the smaller companies. We're talking about, small family companies of maybe 2-3 people. In many cases, we had to call them several times. We had to have people on the ground just knocking on doors, asking them to, complete the survey in person. We had to translate the survey because not everybody speaks English. So there's a wide variety of logistical difficulties when you run a survey. In terms of also the type of information that we're able to collect, obviously we would have loved to include, productive use of energy jobs and other things, but that is just too hard to measure. We also have all of that described in the survey, so I encourage you to go to powerforall.org and download the survey. Thanks.
Thank you, Carolina. And another quick sort of related question, as this is around the comparative resilience of DRE. Did we notice any differences among regions, or is that a world trend in terms of the sector itself being a resilient one?
So I can speak about the 5 countries that we surveyed, basically, but there are other reports that speak about the overall renewables as being quite resilient. So if you look at other reports like from IRENA, for instance, you can see that the entire renewable sector did pretty well. There's a new report by ILO that actually talks about decentralized renewables and how great they did worldwide. So I think there's evidence that DRE has been pretty resilient worldwide.
Thank you for that, Carolina. And one last question, and if I may address this to Suman, this is again in terms of the role of the private sector, and this is a question that's coming from the audience. This is from somebody called Jan. Could you speak a little bit more about the expectations for the private sector to address the SDG 7 goals? And more specifically, which role do you see major international companies playing as compared to smaller and local actors?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing a trend towards partnership between larger companies and smaller actors in the sector. Definitely to support local capacity and build the capacity of local actors, while also bringing in the financing from larger companies. So, you know, Anji has a partnership with Equatorial Power, which is quite well known, and they have projects in various countries. But there are other examples of that. I think for the sector as a whole, we still have a lot to do to build sort of local private sector capacity and investments in the local private sector. There are a lot of barriers to getting financing for DRE companies at the local level. And I think that that's a big push moving ahead to ensure that not only are these companies able to meet local challenges, but they also are, you know, able to garner their government support, which is critical.
Thank you for that, Suman. And I know we're exactly at the end of time for the panel, but we did begin a few minutes late. We still have a few more audience questions, but I'd like to hand it over to Christina for closing remarks today, and we'll get back to the balance audience questions later on through email.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists. It's wonderful to hear, you know, all of these great insights, opinions, and your direct experience of what it's like to be working in these markets. So thank you all for joining today. And I just, you know, want to add a final bit of context. So the Secretary General of the UN this week had mentioned this morning that the UN General Assembly, which is starting today, is meeting during a time of great peril. And so it's really an incredible thing to, as a sector, join together to be able to share some light and some good information on what's possible. So I really thank everybody for all the work that's gone into the report, but the work that the report sits on, which is really in the hands of the decentralized renewable energy community and its sector supporters like those on this call. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining. And don't forget, you can find the full report at powerforall.org, as well as some fact sheets and infographics. So please spread the word. We're eager to share more information in the coming weeks. Please stay tuned. We're doing individual country in-depth launches over the next week and a half or so. And you're welcome, if you care about a particular geography, India, Kenya, Nigeria, etc., to come to those events as well. So thank you so much, and have an excellent day and a great UN General Assembly week. Bye-bye.